can bring your tea and coffee to your table. We want to start with the next lecture as the tea has been moved from 5:30 to now. So we'll now... Can I request everyone in the back to please take their seats? So we're going to move on to the next lecture. This is the 10th lecture in the series, and the topic for this lecture is Making Majorities in Democracies, the Citizenship Embrace. The chairperson for this lecture is Ashutosh Varshney, Professor, Brown University, Providence, and the speaker for this section is Dipankar Gupta, former professor, JNU. Can I please request the chairperson and the speaker to come on stage? We will follow the usual pattern, 40 minutes followed by 10-minute question and answer. Okay, 35 minutes followed by 10-minute question and answer. And can I please request the chair to take over the proceedings?
While introducing Ashish Nandi this morning,
Do you want me to just call out once more?
order. May we call us to order. When Dipankar Gupta introduced Ashish Nandi this morning, he said, if you don't know Ashish Nandi, leave the room. Well, if you don't know Dipankar Gupta, please do not leave the room. For his insights will arrest you, and it's an arrest you should court. Producer of significant work, a significant body of work on caste politics, on evolution of rural society and rural economy, and peasant politics. Dipankar has been at JNU for most of his professional life. All of it. Almost all of his professional life. And every time he enters a new intellectual terrain, he invites, and his insights and his work invite a lot of curiosity. The topic on which he's speaking, I gathered from him this morning, is from a new project, is a new project in itself, and the lecture today is from that project. Surprisingly for our times, it does not have a PowerPoint. Perhaps he believes in the dictum that some do, that PowerPoint gives too much power to those who don't have a point. So with these words, let's welcome Dipankar on a topic of great significance, great abiding significance, as comparative and abiding significance, as well as of great contemporary significance. The question is whether democracies tend to produce, liberal democracies tend to produce majorities. And he asked this question with respect to India, making majorities in democracies the citizenship embrace. Please welcome Dipankar.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Ashutosh. It's a very generous introduction. I spent all my life in JNU because nobody else would have me. So that is it, 30 years or so. Maybe a little more than 30 years because I was a student there as well. This particular piece is part of a larger book, which is on citizenship. I've been thinking about it for some time. And I thought that before I finally cop it, I might as well write down something on the subject. So this is the concluding section of the book, and it is a bit of a twister, and I hope I'll be able to communicate what I do want to say to you. It has a few trigger words, and the biggest trigger word is majority, because every time somebody says majority, all kinds of images are conjured. And I'm afraid you might have that problem even now, though by the end of the day, hopefully, we'll have arrived at some kind of consensus on what could be the meaning of a majority in a democratic setup. I must also tell you that I've always believed that democracy is the hardest thing on earth to practice, because democracy is the most contrived and artificial human arrangement ever. It's not something that comes naturally to us. What comes naturally to us, by the way, is low-calorie intellectual feed like theocracy, dictatorship, monarchy, caste rule, etc., etc. These things come very naturally. And because they come naturally, it's so easy to practice them. Democracy is a very difficult thing because it is not something which is natural. It forces you to think in terms of citizenship, which is why every now and again, when we take our eyes off the ball, democracy slips. And again, it has to be boosted and taken up. It doesn't take very much for democracy to come down. It obeys the laws of gravity, I suppose. But to push it up again takes a lot of effort. And I think that unless we appreciate the problems that are attendant upon keeping democracy going, we'll never really be able to practice it in a wholesome fashion. I was tempted to write on this subject because I've been in touch with a large number of people who have written extensively on multiculturalism. And in my travels within the country and outside, I've often heard people talking about it, discuss this issue, sometimes in a kind of a hostile environment. And I felt that there was something that had to be said that was not being said. It is usually believed that in democracies, the majority has it easy. The majority culture is more or less pre-given. And their lifestyles, etc., are reflected in the democratic arrangement of the day. It's a very tasty matchup. You know, the lifestyle of the majority and democracy, they sort of coincide, and therefore there's no problem. Whereas the minorities have a tough time. They're literally, crawling on glass because it's so difficult for them. At every step of the way, they have to constantly negotiate, do things, drop a part of their burden, while the majority goes about unscathed. This is the point of view that I'm putting it very bluntly, but I don't think I'm missing out the essentials. This is the point of view that I've heard from a large number of people. And I think that there's something that is amiss in all of this. In my view, democracy leaves no culture unmolested. Every culture is interfered with. No culture comes out, without teeth marks of citizenship. You can see them. And I feel that unless we appreciate this aspect, we will not understand the road ahead in terms of taking democracy forward. Because what happens then is that the majority, so-called majority of the day, begin to think that they have it all, they've done the right thing, they are completely in place, in position, almost as if they've won some kind of a talent contest, and the others have to match up to them. What I'm trying to argue here is that what we think is a majority is actually a construction of democracy. And that at some point, democracy probably faltered, which is why a large number of people were still kept out of it. And in the fullness of time, perhaps we'll have one big majority, making the difference between majority and minority quite meaningless. So all right, so if I think that citizenship is a major player, and that actually, interferes with and changes and curbs many of the traditional practices, then what kind of citizenship is this? Where does it come from? As you know, there are many takes on citizenship, all kinds of books written on citizenship, and because I like to take a shortcut, I'm depending on Marshall, T.H. Marshall's notion of citizenship. And T.H. Marshall's notion of citizenship is something that I find not just convenient, but hugely attractive, because it's able to resolve many of the problems that we otherwise don't pay attention to, or leave them unresolved, saying that these are circumstances that will be dealt with later as we go along. But what Marshall said is that citizenship confers an equality of status on everyone. I'm paraphrasing him, of course. Confers an equality of status on everyone, upon which, this is the best part, upon which structures of inequality may be built. So it doesn't say that citizenship requires all of us to be the same. No, but there should be a base where we're all the same. And after that base is accomplished, consolidated, then let's go ahead and be different. I think this is something which is very, very useful for us to use as a kind of an optic to enter into the whole debate on citizenship, culture, democracy, majority, and the rest of it. Therefore, when we discuss culture in the context of citizenship and the kind of constraints it imposes upon culture, one must also take on board the view espoused by some very prominent people that it is impossible to have citizenship of this kind because that actually means an unencumbered individual. Now, that is really not the case. There is no unencumbered individual. Everybody carries the cultural baggage. They have to carry, otherwise you can't be a human being. Symbolism is very much a part of our being, so you cannot be a person without a cultural baggage. The point really is what kinds of cultural ingredients are allowed and what are told to leave and shown the door. That is the point. It's not that you're completely unburdened with culture. You are, you have culture, you have to have culture, but there are certain aspects of it which have to be kept aside. And this is done through the optic of citizenship. Citizenship tells you what is and what is not, what will work, what will not work in the realm of democracy. The initial condition, therefore, is one where there is no majority culture in any democracy. That is the initial condition. It is democracy that makes majority happen. But when we talk about majority, let us try and be a little careful and not confuse majority with domination. They're two different things altogether. They stand in a straight line, but a little parallax will tell you there's a big distance between democracy and between majority and domination. Very quickly, if one were to take the history of, say, contemporary times, not contemporary, modern times, from monarchy to early stages of nationalism and then democracy, you'll find that there are different kinds of domination were in place before democracy actually came in. And when I use the word democracy, by the way, and citizenship, remember, I'm using them in a somewhat idealized form. So if you were to tell me, but what about this and what about that, sure, we'll discuss all those things. But in essence, these are the issues that one must pay attention to in terms of categories they do hold. And of course, as you know, all categories when explicated show a number of nuances. But I'm just talking about the categorical formulations right now. So when we talk about domination, there are two kinds of domination in my view. In a monarchical system, you have domination which is by diktat. That you've got to do this or else. And as you know, most monarchies were ruled by minorities in the sense that they were not numerically preponderant in that community. And the rule of the monarchy or the feudal law or the feudal system, that was, of the court, that was what ruled. And you either obeyed that rule or you sunk. You had no option really. That is not so difficult. The next stage is even more interesting. Because in this first stage of monarchy, of cultural domination, it's a domination with diktat where you have what Karl Mannheim once said was a form of objective epistemology. And Karl Mannheim said this very persuasive in his book, Ideology and Utopia. And if you read it, you will obviously be reminded of a whole host of Western scholars who stand behind Mannheim. But Mannheim's point was this, that till the age of absolutism, you had a period of objective epistemology, which basically meant that the truth was given to you. from above. It could be the church, and what was the innovation that that Mannheim brought was that it need not be the church. It could also be the absolutist state. Both the church and the state impose an objective epistemology in the sense that this is the truth. Now you either like it or you suffer. Now that was over time changed within the period of nationalism, and I'm cutting through a lot of flack and coming to the point directly. In nationalism, you don't have that kind of objective epistemology. What you have instead is a kind of fragmented epistemology. That is, it's true for some people, not true for other people. And that is also the reason why you see in the era of nationalism a difference between the home and the world. Remember that film of Ray, Ghare Baire, the home and the world. The two different worlds we live in, two different compartments, two different universes. So when you're home, you behave in a certain way. When you're outside, you behave in some other way. And what is the way you behave outside? The way of the dominant community. Who is the dominant community? Well, that is a matter of luck, matter of contingent circumstances. Because during the age of nationalism, as you know, and has been made clear by a large number of scholars from Anderson to Hobsbawm and more, that during the period of nationalism, you have commerce really is a major force behind it. That's the engine that propels it. And alongside with that, language plays an important role again, but that language is the language of the state, which is best positioned to take advantage of the commercial opportunities which nationalism has opened up to you. Now, what you find here in terms of fragmented epistemology is that because the world is divided into two sections or three or even more, therefore the idea of uniting is a difficult task. And to be able to unite, attempts are made time and time again by so-called myth makers to create a unity either in terms of language or history or tradition or whatever. You have heard of the ways in which the Romantics, the German Romantics tried to do it. Herder and Fichte. Fichte in particular, I think, is a very important contributor to this cause. And Fichte, to a large extent, learned many of his lessons from Immanuel Kant. But in India, we had the same process too, to create some kind of myth that would tie us together, though our lives are fragmented. Now you see, well, in Western thinking, and I think Western thought is much more developed on this ground compared to non-Western forms of thinking, which I not only talk about, I think about India, but other parts of the world as well. And that is this, that from the time of Hegel onwards, the idea of citizenship was slowly growing. It wasn't full-blown, but slowly growing. It was certainly not there in the time of Kant. The time of Kant, the idea really was, who am I? What am I doing? What is perception? What is aesthetics? What is ethics? What is morality? These were the issues that bothered the Kantians. And as you know, the phenomenon, numeral differences, that too was a big Kantian intervention, which Herder challenged. Otherwise, he was more or less Kantian. What Hegel did was, which is very important, he moved us away from the self to the other. In the phenomenology of the spirit, you find this transition. And this transition is so important because from then onwards, I can't think of a single major Western philosopher who was not philosopher, political scientist, economist, whoever you can think of, Adam Smith included, who has not talked about the other in relation to the self, not as if that other is a specific other, but a general other without which the self cannot be defined or understood, or you cannot understand, shall I say, the activities of the self. Now this is something which is very, very important in my view. And this was brought about by Hegel's intervention, and it was he who said that the public is everywhere. Your son at home, your little child at home, your wife at home, they belong to the public. In the fragmented system of epistemology, you have the home and the world. But in the Hegelian system onwards, you have the public and the private. And these are two different things. The private is not something you do at home. The private is not something you do indoors. The private is something quite different. The public from now on is everywhere. What you do to your wife and children is a public affair. It's not something you can say, it's mine. You can't say that my home is my castle. Sorry, it's no longer your castle. You can't say my son is my son, I can blow his brains out if I want to. In the morning you heard Ashish Nandi talk about that. You can't do that either, because your child is a citizen, is a short citizen, but he's a citizen nevertheless. So this notion of citizenship, and that others have rights which are equal to yours and are similar to you, I think was expressed most cogently by Marshall, which is why I started off with Marshall's definition, because once we look at Marshall, we can retrospectively group all these thinkers together and say, well, yes, this is probably what they meant it to be. This is something that they could have expressed, but did not express till Marshall came along and put it succinctly. Every now and again, you read something, you get a line from somewhere, your point of view, and you ask yourself, why on earth didn't I think of it? It's so obvious, staring at me in the face. But you don't. It needs somebody to tell you. For example, now everybody says that what you think is product of your circumstances. But it needed Marx to say so. Before Marx, nobody said it. But once it's said, it's so metabolized in our system that we don't even think of quoting him. Likewise, the idea of citizenship, I hope, will be so metabolized in our system that we won't even think of quoting T.H. Marshall as time goes along. But this unity was a forced unity, And this forced unity had problems. There were specific kinds of patriotisms, and they had to be curbed. It wasn't easy. For example, in Italy, which is always a paradigm case, you had the Sardinians, the Sicilians, and the Bourbons all sort of fighting to get there in a hurry, as if the food was running out. They all wanted a slice of Italy. So this had to be negotiated. In fact, Massimo de Ziglio had once said, quite famously, the intellectual 19th century, the Piedmont intellectual 19th century Italy, he said that now that we've made Italy, let's make Italians. It was a job that had to be done. Because at that time only about 2% of Italians spoke Italian. Likewise in France too, only 17% spoke French. So the thrust of making a nation state was a difficult one. And this difficulty can be seen in the way in which domination was actually practiced. And if you were part of the major commercial group in that society, then you got a leg up. If you didn't, then you were in some trouble. But most people made peace with that. Even the proud Gaelic Welsh, even they sort of surrendered to the English imperative and became part of that mainstream. But now things begin to change. You have a different sort of arrangement with democracy, and this, as I told you earlier, is very contrived, very new, and you have to always keep an eye on it. It can slip away at a moment's notice. And this is that certain attempts were made from the mid-19th century onwards. And let's take Britain for starters, but we can go to America later, and France, and I've already mentioned Italy, that cultural differences were slowly worn down by democracy's pressures, bit by bit by bit. And when we say something called the Catholic majority, or the Protestant majority, or the Christian majority, or even the Hindu majority, these are all outcomes of democratic pressures. For example, in Britain, for the longest time, since the 1673, I think, Test and Establishment Act, Presbyterians, Methodists, Quakers, Puritans were all considered to be non-conformists. They were all supposed to be dissenters. And as dissenters and non-conformists, there are so many restrictions placed on them. They couldn't hold government jobs of various kinds. They couldn't get a degree in Oxford or Cambridge. That only was possible after 1850, more easily, I should think, around 1870. There was the Burials Act. They couldn't bury their dead according to their customs. They had to follow somebody else's. Now, all of these were bit by bit effaced by democracy's pressures. And today, when we talk of the Protestants in Britain, in terms of a political unity or group, or in terms of public purposes, these differences don't matter that much anymore. Nobody remembers, for example, that there were Protestants and Protestants out there who didn't have a spot in the sun in Britain for a very long time. And now things have come to such a pass that in 2013, they actually passed a law which says that the British monarch can marry a Catholic, which was unheard of earlier. The 1780 massacre of the Catholics is obviously quite forgotten. So now you have a kind of a conglomeration of different Christian groups, and they all believe they are Christian, and nobody says that you're a minority anymore. In the United States, likewise, these groups were in constant conflict for a very long time. And they again had to be tamed by democracy. And as they were tamed, they began to form unities, not as if they gave up their culture, they did not, but for public purposes, they were one. They were not differentiated. You had the Church of the Latter-day Saints who said that you cannot have blacks in the church. They cannot be ordained as priests. Well, that is gone now. That doesn't work. You had the arguments of the Episcopalian Church and the Church of England, which was against abortion. The Roe versus Wade judgment took care of that. Then Brown versus State of Education took care of segregation. So what the point really is that it is democracy that has pressured the so-called majority community to behave. So, and you come to India, of course, from after independence, in the mid-1950s, almost like a shower of meteors, one after the other things began to happen. The Hindu Succession Act, the Hindu Marriage Act, the Hindu Inheritance Act, all of these things happened together. And what was the end product? The end product was there was something called the Hindu majority. Now, if they hadn't happened, what would have been the case? There are so many different kinds of inheritance in our country. Not only the Ayabhaga and the Mitakshara, but you had the Mayuka system and other systems as well. You had also patrilineal primogeniture in parts of Punjab, the Mayuka system in Karnataka and Konkan, and of course the Ayabhaga, Mitakshara and matrilineal system of inheritance as well. So there were all these things, and they were grouped together by the Hindu Marriage Act. And it didn't stop there. It went on further. In 2015 and 2016, two major judgments were delivered by the Delhi High Court. One said that a woman can be the karta of a HUF. The other said that a woman does not have to disclose the name of the father of the child and can be the single guardian of a child. And that is very, very important. It goes against all the basic understandings, you might say, of tradition. So tradition was not left unchallenged. It is constantly being challenged. In France, in 1870s, the Third Republic, after the Third Republic, you had this pressure, you had this movement in 1905 to make sure that nobody wore any obvious religious symbol. And that was the beginning of what they call the laïcité. And this was obviously, you can quite imagine, was objected to by the Pope. He didn't like it at all. And Pope Pius stood on the balcony of St. Peter's and said, "Get rid of this godless government." It didn't happen. And it went from strength to strength to strength. The laïcité, there are many problems with it, I don't doubt that. But there's something very, very important in what the laïcité did. It made people believe and act as if religion was not important in the public sphere. Now this was not complete, this job wasn't complete, but that's the way it was. In the earlier period, as I was mentioning to you, in the period of fragmented epistemology, you had a situation such as that of the Jewish people, who again had to conform. And this was the argument that Bruno Boyer peddled in the book called On the Jewish Question. He said that we Jews should learn to live like the non-Jews, shouldn't look like them, we should look like the rest, and then the storm will blow over us. They won't notice us. This was his view. And of course, you know the famous rebuttal of this by Karl Marx called On the Jewish Question. But even though there were very famous Jewish people in those days in Europe, they had to abide by this notion of who is the boss. Now, things are changing. And the change is there. It's not as if it's completely done and dusted, but it's beginning to happen. In America, till the Second World War, or just after the Second World War, it was rather difficult for a Jewish person to join some of the Ivy League colleges. In fact, there was something called a quota, beyond which you could not have Jewish people. And there were various ways by which they kept Jewish people out of these institutions, because there was, all kinds of, what does your father do? Is your father, does your father have a university degree? What kind of sports do you play? In many ways, they kept them out. After World War II, that was no longer there. And a very interesting book has been written by Karen Botkin Sachs, and that book is titled When Jews Became White Folks. And this Jewish people becoming white folks is a fairly recent happening. I asked a friend of mine what he felt about that book, but he didn't think much of it. All he said was, I'm so glad that people like you came to America, it made us look white. So, at any rate, the fact of the matter is that the Jewish people now see themselves as white folks, and nobody really says that you are a minority, at least in the same way as they used to be pointed and targeted in the past. So then, if this is what democracy has done, or has attempted to do on a number of occasions, has succeeded on several occasions, has failed in many, it doesn't mean that the game is over. It doesn't mean the job is done. I think it tells us there is more to be done. And it can go on and on and on. There's never the best time to fix the roof. You can always do something to it. And I think this is the pressure that democracy places on us. Constantly tells us that don't rest. Keep trying to consolidate people into a group called the citizens, so that those distinctions that people often use to their advantage for political purposes, those cannot be used any longer. This does not mean, as I said earlier, that culture is effaced. It is not. Only those aspects that are egregious to the functioning of citizenship, only those are taken care of and buried deep down, and I hope we dance on their graves. Thank you.
So let me, I would like to use a bit of this time to put a few issues on the table and then invite the audience to come in. I'll just say two things. It's unclear to me, Dipankar, whether your argument is about nationalism of a certain kind, erasing cultural differences, or whether democracy erases cultural differences. What's doing the work? And I use the term nationalism of certain kind advisedly because the field clearly says that the nationalism of the French is different from the nationalism, even though both the French and the US are categorized in literature as having civic nationalism. These are very different kinds of civic nationalism. For example, the hyphen is not allowed in France. You're not Muslim French or Jewish French, just French, undifferentiated French. Whereas the hyphen is allowed in the United States. And it has always been the case, some hyphen, in some cases the left side of the hyphen looked down upon, but people fought and for respectability and got it. So you have Catholics being denied a lot of rights when they first came, especially the Irish when they first came in the 1850s, then the Italians in the 1880s, the Jews came in the 1880s, and they were all, a lot of literature says they were all called inferior races and not quite white. They fought for it, fought for the whatever status they wanted, and they didn't drop their Jewishness, they didn't drop their Catholicism, or their Irishness, right? Whereas in France, you had to drop the left side. So the erasure, it's not clear to me that cultural differences in American democracy have been erased, though an attempt is currently being made, right? But it's not clear it would succeed. Whereas the democracy of France, the nationhood of France erased differences, or sought to erase differences. And it's not clear it's democracy of France which did the work, as opposed to the way the nation. So there is this argument about whether nation is the type of nationhood which is leading to the erasure, or the type of democracy. Yeah, okay, sure.
I do think that's a very important question, and I'm glad you raised it, because the point really is that under nationalism, as I mentioned to you earlier, it's a fragmented epistemology, and there's an attempt at creating a unity which doesn't quite exist because they don't look for consensus. It's a point of view of the dominant community. So there's dominance in nationalism. Whereas when you come to this era of democracy, it's a gradual transition, because democracy came out of nationalism. It's not as if every nationalist society, politics should become a democratic one. There's no such compulsion. But it emerges from nationalism, though it is not a sufficient condition. But in democracy, as it matures and grows, the aspect of domination is overcome by the aspect of consensus, agreement. That is very important. But this agreement is never complete. It's a project that it keeps happening, keeps going on and on and on. It's in continuity. If it happened and finished, then it was fine, but it never finishes. This is why I quoted Herder to you earlier, because Herder is the person who was the author of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis formula. And in his view, human condition is one where your task is never over. The moment you think you finish something, something else crops up. To answer your question, therefore, Ashutosh, democracy has this kind of domination there, and this domination is sought to be masked by the more superior, more powerful community by spreading their message and their point of view and trying to embrace all. Whereas in citizenship, even the dominant community has to suffer, has to give up certain things. It is not their point of view, their world, their life, and their histories that matter the most.
So it follows, and I promise I will open it up. It follows from this then, or the question, the point now would follow from what you've said. In democratic theory, when we do democratic theory in political science, we talk about contingent majorities. We do not talk about permanent majorities. Permanent majorities under democracies would come about only under certain very specific and strict conditions, right? So, for example, you could talk about permanent majority of Malays in Malaysia, permanent majority of Sinhala people in Sri Lanka. But those are not defined by democratic theory as liberal democracies. There, actually, you get into a notion of democracy which begins to give the so-called majority community a special status, and the minorities accept this special status, either because of practical logic or because hegemony prevails and they have been persuaded to accept the status, right? So I think you're saying, one line of your argument seems to be that democracy is about contingent majorities, and this contingency keeps reappearing, in 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, 5 years sometimes, right? So it keeps changing, that is to say. But you also seem to be saying that there is, or are you, that the majority, the notion of majority that democracy has as a principle pushes it towards a permanent majority. Are you saying, which of the two are you saying?
Yeah. Yes. Actually, I'm saying both, and believe me, it's possible. It's like this, that at any one point of time, there will be these contingent majorities. In fact, in the paper that I've written, I've used the word contingent domination. There will be contingent majorities at any one point of time, but that is only when we're looking at the situation as it stands in terms of the appearances. You'll have the Malay majority, you'll have the Chinese majority, the Hindu, the Tamil, whatever, the various majorities you will have. But the point is that in a democracy, some of these majorities will slowly get effaced. And therefore, I would say that there is a telos of democracy. And that telos, over time, we are going to get to larger and larger majorities. And these larger majorities will also be contingent, by the way, until they are overcome but still larger. This project, as I told you earlier, will not be complete. If I say that this is done, is finished, and certain societies demonstrated fully, is laughable. That's not the case at all. But because majority here, as I said at the very beginning of my presentation, is a trigger word, I have to be careful not to arouse the suspicion that I'm talking about certain majorities that are permanent and fixed and culturally laden. I'm saying instead that those communities are there, they'll continue to be there, but the differences between them and other communities contiguous to it will become less and less important because citizenship will take away those aspects that are barriers to their commonality in terms of their public functioning in a democratic space. Which again means that after this is done, what is the next step? And I'm really quite confident that this will happen only when there is pressure from above. It won't happen normally. These things take time, and these things need a lot of intervention, and in every instance that I'm talking about, that had to happen. It didn't come up from the ground, it came from interventions from above.
So let's go to the audience now, as Lord Desai. We need a microphone.
I was very taken by the quotation you said, something to the effect that on a presumption of equality, you create structures of inequality, whatever that was. I think it goes the other way, that by establishing adult franchise, as we did in the Indian Constitution, or as it evolved over time, adult franchise is basically a formal condition of equality. But the world is not equal. And the question that really is whether you have a permanent majority, not a permanent majority, is whether voting behavior is influenced by certain dominant social characteristics or not. So if you are going to vote as a Malay, then Malays are a majority. But if you vote not as a Malay, but as a middle class or whatever it is. So maybe what citizenship in your way of thinking does, it breaks down the hegemonic classification like Malay, Chinese, Hindu, Muslim. And that is what makes democracy an interesting continuing process.
That's
not a question.
More questions. Let me see some of them. Yes, sir. Could you please?
Yeah. Thanks. I'm Indrajit. I work at Oxford University at the Department of International Development there. Thanks, Dipankar. I think it was a very fascinating way to think about citizenship and the ways in which citizenship, democracy tie into each other and progress. Yet I wonder, and in some ways you clarified towards the end of your talk, you offer us a teleological view of things. It seems very clearly that you subscribe to a, one could say an assimilationist view of citizenship, where everyone will become citizens and there'll be this march of democracy. And yet I wonder if, in fact, the Indian case is a counter to that, because what we see is citizenship fostered through difference. You have reservations, for instance, which in some ways foster the idea of citizenship, the idea of membership in the political community, by creating opportunities for different groups. Historically oppressed groups in the structure. We have linguistic states which very categorically and clearly go against the grain of what you're saying. So I wonder if instead of a teleological approach, you actually might find a group differentiated approach to citizenship much more relevant to what you're saying. Thanks.
Is there a third question before we ask there's quite a few. Yeah, actually. Let's go to you, sir.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to thank Dipankar for such a wonderful talk. Oh, sorry. I am Aviram. I teach at the School of Ecology and Environmental Studies at Nalanda University. Yeah, so...
Your voice is booming, so I think if you might have a bit farther.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. So my question is rather than seeing it from the democracy point of view, I would like to draw an analogy. So like in environmental studies literature, nowadays there is a big fashion to talk about anthropocentrism. So there are two strands in that. So one group talks about anthropocentrism, where there is focus on humans or man's, individualist humans, and then there is another group which talks about sociogenic reasons for environmental changes. So when we talk about sociogenic changes or sociogenic reasons, then we talk about politics, we talk about power, we talk about hegemony. But when we talk about anthropocentrism, then it's like diluting the power structure, diluting the hegemony. So similarly, if we are talking about democracy and majorities, so is like what analytical concept does democracy gives us? Like, is it not a very broad, open up category? Whether we should look for more narrowed concepts of state and how states shape ideas of majority and similarly minorities?
Would you like another question or would you like to take the speakers? Okay.
Yeah. I think the idea of voting is a tricky one. But let me say this, that voting alone doesn't account for democracy. Many more things must happen alongside with it. Because we know all these stories, so many of them, about how people of very dubious background have become leaders because of elections. That is true. Therefore, the point that I was making earlier, and this is something that all of us who are interested in preserving democracy should be aware of, and according to me at least, and that is the constant slippages between elections and citizenship. And these slippages are ones that happen quite often. And if you don't think that is important, then that is when it happens. Tagore once said that Satan can only come in when you open the door. I think we talk only about elections, we open the door for other kinds of influences to come in. In terms of reservation, I'm glad you mentioned it. I should have mentioned it myself. Reservation was among those achievements that our government managed to somehow push through in the early years after independence. And if anything, reservation was meant to create this majority, if anything. Because if we look at the thinking behind it, not just of Ambedkar, but everybody else at that time, it was supposed to be a palliative of sorts to make sure that those who had no social assets of any kind were given some kind of help in gaining some social assets. By social assets, I don't mean wealth in the old-fashioned sense of the term, but learning, education, skills, social connections, and so on and so forth. So the idea then was that they would be full citizens of the country, equal to. And Ambedkar himself said that for the majority to have certain rights is terrible, but it's equally terrible for minorities to claim they have certain rights in perpetuity. So that again is a problem. So when you see reservation as minorities or people who have things or some position in perpetuity, that too is wrong. That is why I don't believe in the group having rights. Groups don't have rights, individuals have rights, and as far as groups go, you must have policies that address groups. And when your policies are there, the policy should be in terms of how to break the group up into individuals who have rights so that public purposes can be met. What you do in your pujas or what you want to do in your Ganesh festival is not of much importance so long as citizenship issues are not offended. Just like your son or daughter is a citizen, so also must others be seen as citizens first. When Brian Mulroney in Canada, which happened, one of the most recent examples I think, when he wanted to bring the constitution home to Canada from Britain, he gave all kinds of rights, group rights to the native Canadians. And the women of those communities said that we don't want you to bring the constitution home. If this is what it entails. We don't want the group to come alive again. We were quite happy the way it was. It should have gone further in that direction. Instead of going further in direction, you've looped it back. And we are quite unhappy with it. About your question, I think that I'm not fully sure I understand what you're saying. But if you're saying that assimilation is very important in societies, well, assimilations of various kinds. The kind that I'm talking about is assimilation which is under the stewardship of citizenship, not because of force or power. That is a different thing altogether. It is true that much of this is a long-term process. It doesn't happen right away. But we cannot sort of say that the process is impossible to take forward. And this is something you'll hear time and time again from different people. It is too difficult, we have done our job, we have to make all kinds of adjustments, and that's the best we can do. I don't think that is true. I think, for example, when we talk about the Uniform Civil Code, and here I'm leading with my chin, I think that they made a big mistake in stopping where they did. And I feel that these mistakes are not only made in India, but are made across the world. People somehow give in very early. And who gives in early? Leadership. What happens? Certain leaders die out, and very often people don't come in to take their place. Or if they take their place, they don't have the gumption or the drive to push such matters forward. Democracy is really a lot of intervention.
We have 2 minutes left, I think, organizers. 2 minutes left, right? So we can possibly take 2 very good questions. Let's go to you, ma'am. Yeah. And if we have enough time for Dipankar to respond, we will. We'll see.
Hi, my name is Tony Davis. I'm from the Australian National Science Agency. The acronym is CSIRO. What concerns me about your argument is the lack of physicality, I suppose, the fact that democracies are territorial and have borders and have strong opinions about who can come in and who can't. And this is a huge issue in Europe, and it's been a long issue in Australia where we fundamentally break the law in terms of our responsibilities to refugees and have done for some time. And I'm wondering, I mean, that's one aspect of territoriality. Another aspect is the ecological limits of populations. I mean, democracies are physically composed of a number of people that are dependent on the natural resources available. And how does your argument cope with these realities?
The second one, yeah. Your microphone is not on.
Gaurang Sahai, doing sociology, assistant to Dipankar. Sir, on the basis of my understanding of your presentation, should I believe that Uniform Civil Code will contribute to the deepening of democracy in India and will also contribute to making religious minorities a part of majority?
Do we have the permission to go on for 2 more minutes? No? Okay, so 2 minutes ahead.
I think I'll have to talk to you after the session is over. But very quickly, I'll just say this, that because what you said reminded me of what Harold Lasky said, and there's some old LSE types over here who will immediately identify with that. Lasky said that the theory of sovereignty should be dead and buried. And I think he was right, but of course it won't happen tomorrow. Land and nation will always be there, and when people fight over land, it's quite laughable because it is so old-fashioned and so dated, but we still do it. So you'll find that sovereignty and theories of sovereignty have really died. Who talks of it any longer? There's nothing new that can be said. What can be said, which is new and novel in political theory and in social theory, is, I think, citizenship, not sovereignty anymore. And of course, sovereignty and nation states are very practical things. You want to work citizenship, you have to work it through the nation state, no doubt about it. But the principles of the nation state are inimical, in my view, to the principles of citizenship. And your question was, oh yes, Uniform Civil Code. Now, that should not become a kind of catch-all thing, that Uniform Civil Code is the only thing that's holding us up. Not at all. It's one of the many. In fact, some have made it into a fetish, and that is where it is wrong. Even if this Uniform Civil Code is there, there's so many other things that have yet to be, accomplished. By the way, if a society is monochromatic, it doesn't mean that society is particularly blessed. Even in a monochromatic society, there are problems. Women's rights, gay rights, gay and lesbian rights, environmental rights, the whole host of rights. whole host of problems that afflict even monochromatic single societies. So when people say that, we have so many cultures here and therefore we are at a loss, or we have to especially struggle because of the multiplicity of cultures, then I think they should be also warned that in this monochromatic culture of yours, there are many cultures, many points of views were hidden, and citizenship has to unearth them and flatten them. Thank you.
It's time to thank Dipankar for a stimulating set of lectures. Thank you.